Welcome back, everyone. My name is Steve, and you're listening to the Producer Hive podcast. In this episode, I had the chance to speak with Jordan Valeriote. Jordan is an immensely successful producer, mixer, and engineer who's built a name for himself in the harder genres of rock and metal. He's worked with bands like Silverstein, Neck Deep, Forevermore, and Intervals, so we know there's weight behind his methods. He's also the founder of Hardcore Music Studio, one of the leading platforms and YouTube channels to learn how to record, mix, and produce both rock and heavy music. In this podcast, Jordan shared his thoughts on tracking bands, session organization so you're not killing the vibe while mixing. He also shared some of the top audio myths that could be limiting the full potential of your mixes. And there's much more packed into this episode, but overall, you won't want to miss it if you're looking for some hints on how to take your skills to the next level. And let's face it, we all are. Check out links in the description and show notes for more info on Jordan's courses, and please consider subscribing to the podcast to make sure you don't miss an episode. So get ready, and we hope you enjoy episode 2 of the Producer Hive podcast. I wanted to start off by talking about tracking methodology. So I've been following your work for quite a few years now, and I see you working a lot of times straight out of the box or in the box. And I'll also see you in large traditional studios. So can you tell us a little bit about the pros and cons of each of those in your experiences and when you might actually book time in a larger studio versus working out of this setup that we see right now?
Yeah, so I'm totally comfortable working in either scenario, just like a home studio, basement studio, a small project studio. I mean, I made most of the records on my discography in a really small garage, that kind of standalone garage that was converted into a project studio. Really small room. Like all in all, it was maybe 600 square feet with control room and live room together. So I'm totally comfortable there. But like you said, I've also been able to make some records in big spaces. And some of my training in when it comes to tracking, I've got a full course recording a band, and that's in a pretty nice space and everything. So in terms of pros and cons, when it comes to tracking, you can't deny it's nice to have a lot of space. It's nice to have a big selection of mics and gear. It's really nice. It's like a treat. And if there's a budget, and it's possible, then it's just great to work in those spaces, especially for drums. That's really like the main thing. Because when it comes to recording guitars, you're just putting a mic in front of an amp, or vocals. Again, you're just one mic on a vocalist. But for drums, like having a really nice sounding room and being able to get that natural big room sound, I really love being able to do that when possible. But I really don't want people to be discouraged if they can't do that, because like I said, I make most of my records in a tiny space, and there's only been a handful where I've been able to do it in a big, nice studio with the big console and everything. But it's really just for the drum recordings, just having that space. It cuts down on nasty reflections, and like I said, you get that nice big room sound. But when it comes to mixing and really tracking anything else, I'm happy to do it in a small space as well.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. It seems like no matter what you do in a small room, you're never going to get really good room sound out of a drum kit. No matter how many, you can see like I have a bunch of baffles over here. It really doesn't matter. It's just there's so much chaos with the acoustics in the room that it always seems to mess it up. But kind of leading off of what you said there about mixing in the box. Watching your stuff, I know you are a really big proponent of heavy edits, and there seem to be two schools of thoughts around that. There's either, you record it as honest and as purest as possible, or kind of a one take go. And then there's also, when you do multiple takes and you do, composite edits and composite tracks. So a lot of people will say though that kills the vibe. So what has driven you to track that way, where you do heavy edits to get the performance done?
Yeah, I mean, so I've heard that argument too. It kills the vibe. It's not real. If you have to do these punches and these edits in the studio with the band, then they can't play it live, all these reasons. But, I would say that nothing kills the vibe worse than bad timing and bad tuning and just sloppy performances. That kills the vibe way more than editing usually does. So what led me to kind of go in that direction was talking to a couple producers who were way ahead of me, like guys who were working on the records that I loved listening to, and just asking them questions. And one of the big light bulb moments for me was I was talking to this producer named Andreas Magnuson. He's worked on some records that I really love. And they were tracking, he was with a band tracking guitar, and I was lucky enough to be able to instant message with him back and forth. And he said something like, yeah, in a full 8 to 10 hour day of tracking, we're getting between 1 and 2 songs done on rhythm guitar. And I was just like, what? Like, what are you talking about? Like, I would do a full album of guitars in one day. Like you said, just hitting record and letting them play through it, maybe do a couple takes to see if they can do it better. But he's talking about just like making sure everything is perfectly in tune. He talked about how they're spending so many hours just like making sure the parts were in tune. And I kind of asked a few questions, and he talked about how he's splitting things up and it just takes a long time. And so then I started listening to his records with that in mind. And then I started listening to a bunch of other records that I loved. And all of a sudden it hit me. I was just like, wait a second. There are no mistakes on these records. Like, everything is locked in time. It's in tune. The performances are flawless. Like, there aren't mistakes. And I was comparing that to my work. Is like, there's a ton of mistakes. There's a ton of sloppiness, and I'm just totally at the mercy of how well a musician is playing their part. And so that just totally shifted my mindset. And I began to realize that was like the number one difference between amateur and pro records. It's that professional producers and engineers, the standard is set really high, and they're not allowing anything to get by unless it hits that standard. So, I will say that my goal is not to edit stuff as much as possible. My goal is to edit stuff the least amount as possible, right? So sometimes you're blessed to work with really great drummers or guitarists or vocalists, and you can get those great takes, and they can do big chunks, and you don't have to have a really heavy hand with edits, and that's awesome. Other times, the band's not prepared. They're just not as good players, but, I'm not going to let something with my name on it come out and not be stellar. So sometimes it does take a really heavy dose of those things, and sometimes it's a mix. But my goal is always to not kill the vibe, definitely. Like, I want to hit that sweet spot where it sounds competitive, it sounds modern, it hits that modern pro standard, but yet still sounds human. Like, I'm always trying to aim for that sweet spot.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a problem a lot of people run into when they're first starting recording. They'll listen to their tracks, and obviously there's a lot that is missing when you're first starting off, but you'll definitely notice that the amount of effort it takes to get your guitars, the drums, vocals to be sounding, record or album ready. And it was definitely an aha moment when you figure out that you can edit to that. And again, it's not the goal to, of course, chop something up a million times, but when you realize that you do have that power where you can take a performance and go beyond maybe just the hitting space bar to record and then kind of that's your track. It's extremely powerful. And I remember it was definitely an aha moment for me that then I can really, if you do have a band come in that is less than stellar, or they're just starting off too, you can help bring them to that next level. So yeah, I completely agree with you with regard to kill the vibe. I don't think that's the case. If you play a tune and everything is off and the sync and that definitely kills the vibe from a listener's standpoint much more.
Yeah, way worse. Right? I kind of use the example of, like, let's say you were a model and you're going for a photo shoot, and you wake up that morning and there's pimples all over your face, but you're going for this photo shoot, right? And so you go and you're all embarrassed, and you're like, that you're not looking your best, but you go ahead with it, and then a week later you get the photos back, and your skin looks flawless. It looks like the best version of you, even though you had all these problems. And so I always tell people, like, look, if you're the model in that scenario, are you going to be mad at the guy who edited the photos? Or are you going to be like super grateful that they presented you in the best possible light? That's kind of how I look at it.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And, we spoke a couple weeks ago, and we brought up this concept of, getting it right at the source. And I had always thought of it more of like a technique, this technique of getting it right at the source, but you had mentioned that it was more of like a change in mindset. So can you tell me what that means to you, getting it right at the source, and what was that change in your mindset in, approaching that for tracking?
Yeah, I think the change in mindset is, like, when I think of getting it right at the source, it's not just about dialing in a great tone or having a really nice sounding drum kit. That's part of it. But it's also about the performances, like I talked about, and making sure everything is really tight, in tune, great feel, great vibe on the performances. The mindset change is, I call it a gold standard mindset. And I think the big thing is taking responsibility. It's like, as a producer, it's not just about plugging in the mics and putting it in the right spot, like all the technical stuff. That's only half of it. Like the other half is deciding, like, no matter what problems we run into, including performance problems, like I am going to take responsibility for doing whatever we have to capture this in a way that sounds professional, and that when you play it on shuffle on your iPhone or in your music library, or it comes on Spotify randomly against other pro commercial records, it's going to stand up to it and it's going to sound competitive. So I really think it's a mindset shift of just setting your standard really high, and just not letting anything through that doesn't hit that. And it can be hard because, man, after 6-7 hours in a tracking session, tracking guitar for a song, and you're slogging through it, like the temptation to just let things go by and think, I'll edit that later, or I'll fix that in the mix. It's a strong temptation, but you got to have the mindset to just have that standard of excellence and kind of pull other people up to it if they're not hitting it.
There's definitely more of like an X factor to engineering. It's just not the technical aspect of putting a microphone and getting level set right and just getting a good tone straight in. There's a lot more. And I think bands, certainly when they're starting off, they look to you, even if they don't necessarily know it, to have that understanding in the studio and how to make that translation. So you mentioned guitar. Can we take that as an example? So what are some things you do when you're tracking, let's say, electric guitar, to quote unquote get it right at the source? What are some things that you consider?
Yeah, so first thing, just starting at tone, I try to capture the best possible tone I can as simply as possible. So if we're talking about like a distorted rhythm guitar for a rock or metal or whatever, or really any kind of pop rock genre, that means for me, like hopefully just one mic on the cab in the right spot on the speaker, and that's it. And just dialing in a great tone from one amp and cab, one mic. And then and my goal is for that tone to sound pretty much how I want it to sound on the final mix. So there's no question of like, is this tone good? Is it going to work? Maybe I'll have to EQ it or reamp later. It's like, no, I want that to sound like 80-90% the way I want it to sound in the mix. If I know that it's going to need a bunch of EQ, then the tone's not good enough. We start over, or we keep going. So that's the starting point. And then in terms of getting performances, I guess if I can kind of paint a picture, like let's say we're recording the chorus for a song. Well, I'm just going to sit there and I'll ask the guitar player, okay, play through this chorus for me. And I'll maybe get him to play through it a couple times while I watch him play it and I'm listening to how it sounds. And so I would listen to that and start to pinpoint problem areas. So maybe there's one chord change where he's kind of sloppy getting into that next chord. So I'll think, okay, we need to split it up there. We need to punch in there. Maybe there's one part where he's moving from low on the neck to high up and it's kind of noisy, scratchy. He doesn't do it cleanly. I'll just try to like work from the whole thing and then go backwards to see like how much can we get before the performance starts to get sloppy. We'll stop there. We'll just get that much. Okay, then what's the next part? Let's get that as well as we can, and so on. So it really is a process of like problem solving. That's kind of how I think of tracking, especially guitar, is problem solving. It's starting with the whole chunk, the whole verse, the whole riff, chorus, whatever it is, and then identifying those problem areas and figuring out what's the best way to solve that. Is it going one chord at a time or 4 notes at a time? Can he do 90% of it, but then we just need to go in and punch in this one spot in the middle? What's going to get the best feel with the tightest sound, with the best tuning? Sometimes we're like, I've been in sessions where for whatever reason, it's just the part or the guitar or the player, the way he's holding the strings. It's like, he's got to hold the chord and then we've got to switch to the next chord. And then he's got to hit each one of those notes in the chord. And I've got to tune every one of those notes in the chord. And then we punch in that chord and then we do it again for like all the chords. It's a pain. And Evertune guitars make life a lot easier these days. But that's just problem solving. If we got to do that, we got to do that. So that's one example.
Yeah. So I like to use this example if you took let's say a sports car, let's say you have a Ferrari, this really high performance vehicle, right? And you left it outside. You never took care of it, never rotated the tires, you didn't change the oil, kind of let everything kind of go to crap, and then you went to drive it in a race, it wouldn't still function as a high performance vehicle, or certainly not as it would originally. And this is something I always talk to beginning audio engineers about is, it's it's a little bit of a difficult area, but it is your job, I would say, to still know the instruments that you're going to be recording, and then make sure that the bands coming in and the musicians coming in check things like the strings are new, make sure any batteries are changed, that the intonation is set properly. All these little things that make a big difference, because I've tracked before with people who bring in this super expensive, big name instrument, and then it sounds absolutely awful because the strings are 6 months old and the pots on it are crackly. So there's so much that goes into it, and what you're alluding to, it's small little changes all the way throughout the process that really make a big difference.
Yeah, you're totally speaking my language. That's exactly what I teach and say too. Like, as an engineer, like, you've got to know the basics of the instrument. Like, if you can at least be able to tune a drum kit, like, basically you don't have to be a drum tuning expert, but at least if you can replace, snare and tom heads and get a decent sound out of them, and intonate guitars, know what string gauge to use, change the strings or intonate, set guitars up. That's a huge asset in getting it right at the source, getting great sounds, having tuning be okay for guitar and bass, because, like, frankly there's going to be a lot of clients that you work with who just don't know how to do that stuff. Like, after many years recording bands in the studio, even bands that had got to a fairly high level, it's like, I would say 80% of the time, like, they don't know how to tune their drum properly, they don't know how to intonate their guitars, and so having that skill set, which is not that hard to learn, really helps out a lot.
Yeah, and sometimes there's even like a resistance because, there's like money involved with, your time and the studio's time. So I think many musicians don't see the benefit of that early on. Like, we need to take an extra hour to make sure that the drum kit is tuned properly and that we have everything so that all the heads aren't maybe resonating sympathetically with one another. When you hit the snare, the tom isn't warbling, the floor tom. Right. But so a big part of that, though, is learning the instruments. And I think you're a guitarist in the past, and I know I was a guitarist before I got into recording. So for people who aren't musicians to start off, what do you tell them? How can they start learning these little bits about different instruments?
Yeah, I think depends if they want to pay or not. I mean, I'm trying to think of how I learned that stuff. I mean, I think just from talking to, like, if I came across someone who, let's say, they knew how to set up and intonate guitars really well, I would watch what they were doing. I would ask them questions and figure that out and try it for myself. And the more you do it, the more you learn what works and what doesn't. So I think just talking to people who are ahead of you is a big thing. Of course, you can look on YouTube and look online for tutorials, and you can find some good stuff. There's also some bad info out there. So that's why I say, you got to be careful. That's, inside my training system, I include all that stuff, like, kind of just go-to ways. I don't cover every way to tune a drum, but if you want like a modern punchy rock kick, snare, and tom sound, I can show you how to do that. And the formula is really simple. And that's just, if someone comes in and they can't do it at all, well, just do it this way, and it's going to sound great. So it's hard not to get overwhelmed or know which way is right. But I think the key always is just to find someone whose work you like, who's really doing this in the real world, and just ask them questions or find out a way to be mentored by them or learn from them, and try to make progress in one direction rather than like try to learn every possible technique from every person. Right? Yeah.
Oh, that is such great advice, though, because we have YouTube and there are millions of videos that we can access. And of course, some of them are less than stellar, and then others are really great. But I think many professional engineers, they have different techniques to still get absolutely stellar results. Yeah. So I'd completely agree. If you can find one person that you really do like their work, and if you just stick with it long enough, you can learn their methodology. And then once you have that down, then you can start diverging. And it's pro and con of it, good and bad. YouTube gives you access to all this stuff, but then it can also send you down so many rabbit holes that aren't always the best.
Yeah, you can't be starting over with a new technique every time you sit down to track or mix. Like you have to go in one direction for a certain period of time to really get a hold on things, I think.
And that's a great segue. So I wanted to ask you about your methodology when you look at it. I think we've all gotten to the point where, as you were saying, finish recording session 6-12 hours, whatever it is, and you're just so overwhelmed by the amount of editing that you have to do before you feel like you can even sit down and mix. Or maybe you want to start mixing because that's what their timeline is, but you haven't finished your edit. So what do you do to keep, the extremely technical and sometimes even boring aspect of engineering separate from the editing, separate from the mixing, so that you don't kill the energy? You don't basically rob yourself of the fun of this really creative process.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, there's different elements when you're talking about editing or maybe like mix prep. In terms of editing, like if I'm tracking a project, the editing is kind of happening along the way. So we would track drums and I would edit all those drums before we move on and track everything else. So you're not necessarily left with this mountain of editing at the end. So tracking drums, editing them first. And that's, if it's a full album, that could be like, once we're done tracking the drums, that could mean like, hey guys, you got a day or two off while I edit these drums, and then come back when they're done. So at least that's taken care of. And then when we move on to guitar and bass, I'm kind of editing those on the fly because like I said, I'm trying to get those performances right at the source. I think it's really hard to edit guitar and bass after the fact and get great results. I think it always sounds pretty bad actually. So I'm always trying to get that during the tracking stage. And then I'm kind of editing on the fly, crossfading, nudging a few things here and there when needed, so that by the time I'm done tracking guitar and bass, I might go through and spend like 5 minutes, quick cleanups. But it's pretty much there. Like there's no editing there. And then for vocals, that's where the bulk of the time is at the end is, after we finish tracking vocals, it's typically the last thing we track. So then, there is a little bit of a pile up at the end there, get through all the vocal tuning, then we move on to mixing. But I think in terms of, what you're saying is, for me, I think it's really helpful to keep the separate parts of the process separate. And it's really important for people who are recording their own music too, is like, don't be like recording and mixing at the same time. You know what I mean? Like, and don't be editing and mixing at the same time. Like, even if I tracked a project and I'm mixing, like all the editing is done before I sit down to mix. It's a very clear separation of the process. And if I'm getting sent something to mix, something that someone else tracked, then, editing is not part of that. That's, if they need edits, that needs to be discussed ahead of time. And that's something I would do first, or I would outsource it so that, I'm just sitting down to mix. It's not like I'm going to start editing a drum part when I'm in the middle of a mix, or tuning a vocal. That's not the time for it. So I think having that clear separation between those parts of the process is super key for me.
Going back to what you mentioned about, you finish recording your drums and then maybe you give the band, you'd tell them, hey, come back in 2 days and we'll start the next process of it. I love that concept of having, again, it goes back to us saying, what is your expectation and what is your role as the engineer? It's to guide the band through that process. And I certainly know that was something I struggled with. Bands will come in with preconceived notions of what recording is, or maybe what it was like at their last person. And I know I've had people make kind of cracks when I'm trying to edit to make something good in the session. And they'll comment like, oh, well, other engineers have already had, the mix done by now. And it's like, well, we're on the tracking stage, and sure, I can throw a bunch of, pre-programmed EQs and compressors on there and with a bunch of templates. But I don't think a lot of people see that the process takes that much more time. And I agree with you completely. It's really important to separate the two and isolate them so that when you do sit down to mix, you can actually sit down and have fun with it. And you're not having to go back and worry about, are the drums perfectly time aligned, or is something still out of tune with your vocal line? Yeah,
exactly. And I like what you're saying too about being the one to guide the artist or the band through the process. And I will say that there's an evolution here, right? Like when I started out, for one thing, I didn't really know how to do any of this stuff that I'm talking about. So, it wasn't happening. But as you're learning, as you're growing, you start to gain more knowledge and ability to control sessions. And you should eventually get to the point where, artists are coming to you and like you are fully controlling the flow of that session. Like, first we're doing this, then this, then this. Here's what you need to bring. Here's what you don't need to bring. And like you said, guiding them through and just not. I think that, again, another difference between like maybe an amateur who's still learning. I'm not necessarily saying amateur in a negative way, but just someone who's not at that pro level yet, is like the habit is to default to letting the band make all the decisions, and well, they're paying you for a reason because they don't know how to record themselves. So why are you letting them make the decision about, whether the sound's good enough or what you should use or what you should do next? Like that's your job. It's not like when you go to a restaurant, the chef comes out and says, I normally make it with this ingredients, but if you want me to, switch it up, like, what recipe do you want for this this chicken or whatever? It's like that doesn't happen. Like, you're there for a reason because you like what they do. So that's something it doesn't happen like that when you're starting out, but it is where you need to get to if you want to do this professionally.
Yeah, it's something to aspire to. It's definitely not where you step in the studio for the first time and you have that confidence in doing it. And I would definitely say, like, don't hide behind the gear like that. Right? Mm-hmm. It's not just the gear. People are not paying you for the gear that you have. They can rent a studio. I agree. It's that X factor again, what you are bringing to the table, your expertise in making an album, an EP, and producing it.
Yep.
I'm going to be asking you a few questions here, and they're a little bit more fun. And if you can, just answer them in maybe 1 or 2 sentences. So the first question: a zombie apocalypse in your city has forced you to flee and start over. So you have to settle down on an island, and this is one of the coolest islands because it just happens to have a music store on it. So you have $5,000 to spend to rebuild your studio from scratch. What do you buy?
So I would basically, here's the list of gear that I would want, and I would just choose, whatever the best I could get within that budget. So I would get like an 8-channel interface. I get 2 or 3 SM57s. I get an AKG D112 for the kick drum, assuming the goal is to record bands. I'd get a pair of small diaphragm condensers, maybe some Shures or Rhodes, once you can get a pair for, $500 or so. I get a used Mac, or the best Mac that I could get, and I get Pro Tools, the Waves SSL plugin bundle, and if there's any money left over, I'd get the Neural DSP Nolly, what's it called, Archetype Nolly amp sim plugins, because I think those sound great and just as good as the real amps that I love in the studio. So I think, I didn't officially go and add all this up, but I think I could squeeze that in under $5K.
All right, so question 2. You get to form a super band of your dreams and record and produce your album. So who's in the band and why?
Yeah, this is a fun question. Okay, I would say for vocals, I love the lead singer of the band Pierce the Veil. Just love his harmonies, his vocal work, his melodies, performances are great. For guitar, one of my favorite guitarists is Taddei from Thrice. So I pick him. For drums, actually a guy who's local here, his name's Nathan Bulla, plays drums for the band Auras and Intervals, who I've worked with in the past. Phenomenal drummer, love his style. And for bass, I honestly can't think, man. Like, there's not a bass player that stands out. I mean, maybe I would play bass. I like playing bass, but that would be my dream band, I guess.
So last question I have for you. So you build a time machine, you travel back in time, and you're able to work with any band or producer. Who are you in the studio with, and what are you working on?
Yeah, I think I would choose the band Thrice, again, one of my favorite bands, and this four album project they did called the Alchemy Index. They did like 4 different EPs, and they just recorded it at home by themselves. So their guitarist Taddei produced it and engineered it, and I just think it's so cool. Like, I love the songs for one thing, and then I also just love the sounds that they captured, and it was great. I think it'd be great to be a fly on the wall or to be involved in that. One of my favorite album projects.
Jordan, a lot of your content revolves around dispelling audio myths. Some of them, the common ones, always cut before you boost, maybe outdated gain staging concepts now that we're in the digital domain. Different things with EQ, where don't EQ, don't subtract more than 3 decibels, and different things like that. So can you share with us some of your favorite audio myths?
My favorite ones that I hate the most, you mean?
That's right.
Yeah. I'd say the gain staging one is a big one. I get asked about it all the time still, even though I've done a couple videos about it. And there was kind of this wave of videos that came out a number of years ago that they would say, well, all these plugins, they're designed to work like analog gear, and analog gear expects this level of minus 18 dB. And so you should therefore reduce all your tracks to minus 18 dB before it hits any plugin. And the thing is like, the thing that I don't like is that it's kind of sold and taught as like, this is the reason that your mixes sound bad, is that you're not putting these down to minus 18. It's just like, when I heard that, I mean, I already been mixing in the box for many years, and it's like, what are you talking about? Like, I don't do that. That has literally never been a problem. I've never worried about that. And it's just, it just makes no sense to me. And you could get into the technical things about why in the digital world, like even if your plugin is clipping, there's a ton of headroom above that. Even if your track output is clipping, there's actually it's not really clipping like an analog piece of gear is. Like there's a ton of headroom behind the scenes there digitally. But you know, at the end of the day, it's like, that's not the thing that's going to make the difference. Like, sure, maybe if you're always clipping your stuff and running out of headroom, like, you know, that's going to help. But it's like, there's this idea that like, if you don't do this, your plugins are going to sound bad. And that's what's holding you back. And it's like, no, that if you're lucky, you might get like a 5% improvement, but that's not changing your mixes, you know? And so that's one thing that I think a lot of people stress about, worry about, spend a long time watching videos about, and it just does not matter. Like, this is how simple it is. Is the red light on all the time? Turn it down. Is it not? You're good. Like, that's all you need to know.
It's not as flashy sounding though.
No, no, it's not. Yeah. Another one is definitely the whole thing about not boosting more than 3 dB with your EQ. And, you know, the argument is that, you know, if you boost a lot with your EQ, you're introducing these phase problems. And it's like, all I got to say is just like, just watch Chris Lord Algae mix, you know, it's like you're grabbing that thing and you're just cranking it, you know, like until it sounds good. And I try to do some videos, or I have done some videos where I try to demonstrate that, where I'll go to a mix I've done, let's say like on a kick or a snare drum. And I'll say like, okay, I'm going to stick by the 3 dB rule, and I'll only boost something 3 dB. And I play it, and it's like, it sounds really boring, really dull. It's like there's a blanket over the speakers. And then it's like, okay, here's how I would actually mix it. And you know what? Sometimes, like on that Waves SSL plugin, like sometimes I've got that thing literally maxed out on like 8K on a kick or a snare or even a vocal. And that's just normal. It's okay. It's normal for me to boost 9 dB at 8K on a kick and a snare and a vocal. I do it all the time. And if you're afraid to do that and you're allowing yourself to be limited by these artificial boundaries that someone said online, then it's a severe handicap in your mixes for real. And it's not, I think that's a downside of mixing in the box. And I mix totally in the box, so don't get me wrong. I've never mixed on a console fully. But I have worked on a console, and the feeling is very different when you're mixing in the box and you're turning an EQ or something. And you're looking at that EQ graph or whatever, like you're thinking about it with your eyes so much, like, oh, how does this look? Does this look like a really big boost? Does it look too extreme? Versus just grabbing a knob and just like turning it and listening and using your ears, you know? So, and on like an SSL console, if you've ever used one, like when you touch that knob and turn it, like for you to really even feel like you're hearing anything, like you're turning it like at least 4 or 5 or 6 dB, you know? So just by the nature of the size of the knob. So, you know, I think it's very easy to go astray using your eyes to mix instead of your ears, which is a little bit of an obstacle in the box, but something you can definitely overcome.
I think that's one of the biggest hindrances. If you try and follow that rule of 3 dB or 4 decibels, one, you're just thinking so analytically and critically about your EQ, and you're like you said, you're not even using your ears at that point, other than to see if you've hit 3 decibels or not. Right. And it leaves your albums, whatever you're working on, just sounding unprofessional. It is not possible. I've never found it possible to get that really clicky metal kick sound if you're only talking 3 decibels here or there. It's just not possible.
It's not possible. Yeah, and it's trying to mix by like math rather than with your ears, right? That's just not how it works. And another thing is like, I used to get asked a lot, you know, like what frequency do you put your kick drum in and your bass drum in? And I understand the sentiment of like, maybe you don't want them fighting and overlapping too much, of course. But again, use your ears to make that decision, because there are tons of mixes where I'm boosting 60 hertz on the kick and I'm boosting 60 hertz on the bass, both at the same time, and I'm cranking them both and it sounds good. Sometimes is it too much? Yeah, but that's what your ears are for. But I think a lot of people are approaching it of like, before they even listen, they'll go and like high pass filter their kick at a certain spot, and then they'll go and high pass filter their bass at a certain spot. And they've just decided in their mind that their kick is here and their bass is here. And they've made that decision before they even hear it together, right? And, that's what you want to avoid. And remember, it's mixing. It's like stuff is supposed to mix together. If you have everything too separate, it's not a good mix. Like, we like mixes that are moving together, interact. All the instruments are interacting, sounds like a band. Like, that's what we're after. It is mixing. So, you can't be too obsessed about trying to perfectly separate everything. You lose all the energy.
Right. It'll just sound sterile too. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, I think that's a big trap that people fall into when they are first starting off, because you're trying to learn, right? And I think when anyone tries to learn, they try and find these guidelines, these steps to make something sound professional. So it's really easy to find these rules like that you follow, or like you said, throw a high pass filter in this range. But yeah, if people would just focus on actually listening, which is something that's so much harder now that we're using, in the box. Everything is visual. The graphic user interface is made to really look interesting to us. But yeah, yep. I mean, if you can just shut your eyes and, actually like twist the virtual knob, you'll get back to what people used to say in the analog world of actually, using your ears. So if you could give us one more, what's one more of your audio myths that keeps you up at night?
Well, we've talked about EQ. I know I could talk about people who say you should only use subtractive EQ, just take away everything that's bad and then you'll be left with a great sound. It just doesn't work. But maybe we'll switch and talk about compression. I remember seeing one tip out there that was basically saying like, hey, since we're in the digital world now, you don't need to use a lot of compression to control the dynamics. You can just automate the fader. Like, don't use a compressor, because then you might get distortion. You might get all these artifacts. So why not just do it with just use your mouse and draw on the level to control it, right? And again, this will absolutely doom your mix to boring land. It's like pro rock, pop, heavy mixes are like they're dripping with compression. Like, if you listen to any lead vocal track on the radio, like the breaths are louder than the words. That's how much compression is on there. So I think that's, again, this is something that comes with experience, but you start to realize that compression is not simply level control. That obviously is the most basic function of it, but it's so much more. And it's a hard thing to really teach, because it just takes a lot of hours of hearing different compressors and how they sound and how they work. But using compression, you can change the feel and the energy and the impact of a track like so dramatically. You can, just by changing the attack and the attack time, you can either push something back in the mix, or you can bring something right up front and make it sound twice as aggressive as it was performed. So I think this whole idea of like avoiding compression, again, playing it safe with compression, just do a little bit, and automate the rest. Like that's not how pro mixers think of it at all. So that's another myth that you definitely want to steer clear of.
Yeah, I agree. I think compression is one of the most difficult things to kind of wrap your head around.
It is.
But right, compression can be used for just reducing the overall dynamic range. You can use it for increasing the like perceived aggressiveness of like snare, kick drums.
Yep.
You can use it for just like mild stopping, clipping, so that you're not pushing. Like your snare track, for example, isn't the loudest thing in the mix. You can just chop the tops off and then use your maybe a different compressor to improve that perceived aggressiveness of it. So
yep.
Yeah, I agree. That's a big one. And and I'm sure you'd completely agree. Like automation has its place.
Oh yeah.
But under that guideline of we don't need compressors, we'll just automate. Yeah, that not quite.
Yeah, no, I mean, I do a ton of automation. I have to have something like this because I do so much of it that there's no way I could do it with a mouse. But yeah, it's not necessarily for, it's not in place of a compressor. And in fact, often like when I mix, it's like there's tons of compression everywhere, oodles and oodles of compression, and it's like it's kind of limited the dynamic range. And then I use automation to like add some of those dynamics back in like a really musical, creative way that creates impact and movement through the song.
We've kind of talked about this a little bit before with like YouTube and when you first started off. audio engineering, it's such an art and a science, which we've been dancing around this whole time. It's very, very technical. And I think mentorship plays a really big role in this, as we said, finding one person that you can follow and learn from. And then once you have kind of your feet on the ground, then you can start diverging and developing your own personal styles, or maybe go on to someone else to learn what their techniques are. So what was it like when you first started off? Did you work directly under someone else?
Well, early on, no. I basically just had the opportunity to buy a bunch of gear, a really kind of basic setup, and take over renting this converted garage studio. A friend of mine was getting out of it. And I knew it's what I wanted to do, but I didn't know anything about it. But I just jumped in, and I was playing in bands. I had a bunch of friends in bands, and I just jumped in, and he showed me how to plug in a mic and get the signal in and hit record, and that's all I had. I didn't know what a plug-in was. I didn't know what EQ was. All I knew is to record a track in Pro Tools and then just like use the faders and the pan knob. That's what I thought mixing was. I didn't know there was more to it. So I just jumped in, tried to teach myself for maybe like a year and a half or so. And I realized very quickly that like, I thought it was easy. I thought it was like, yeah, I'm a music guy. Like if I can just sit down behind the board, like I'll be able to get great sounds. And it turns out it wasn't that easy. My stuff sounded pretty bad. So eventually I got kind of frustrated and be like, I need to find some way to really make some progress quickly here, because, you know, there's just too much for me to figure out on my own, and it's too slow doing trial and error. So I started looking for an internship, like at a bigger studio. I was lucky enough to land one in a studio in Toronto here in Canada. And it was great. I was there for about 6 months. You know, I knew my way around Pro Tools and stuff, so I got to actually be involved in some sessions, help set up mics, but did also a lot of classic intern grunt work, right? And I learned a lot there from the house engineer who works there. But there was 1 week where this producer named John Fields came in with the Jonas Brothers, believe it or not. They were tracking their second record, and they were there for a week or about 6 days or something, and I got to just be a fly on the wall while they tracked these songs, like 6 songs. This album went on to be mixed by Chris Lord-Alge, went platinum. So just seeing how he was able to basically build a pop rock song that sounded like a record. It sounded like what you would hear on the radio right there in the studio. You would they'd have the song idea, the rough idea. They'd track the drums, they'd track the guitar, they'd track the bass. And within a day, it's like, it sounds 80% like a finished record. And it was just, he worked so fast. He didn't care about all the like little nitpicky details that I was used to hearing everyone talk about on gear sluts, about how like when you're setting up your kick drum mic and, doing a shootout with 5 different mics and then blending some of them and then doing a shootout of which preamp to use. Like, it wasn't like that at all. He was just like, he knew exactly what he wanted and just, okay, this mic right here, this preamp, boom, there we go, let's go. It was very quick. And so that was really like, that was like a life-changing week, honestly, just seeing how he worked, seeing how decisive he was, how fast he worked, how it really wasn't about the gear at all. Like, I was in Gearland of like, I need certain mics, I need the right techniques even, and that's how I'm going to get great records. It wasn't that at all. It was like, the gear is just a tool. Like, who really cares what gear it is? As long as it's serving its purpose and it's not holding you back from keeping the session going and being creative. Like, I could tell that he was doing everything he could to make the gear never be in the way. Like, he never got stopped trying to choose which mic. He never got bogged down by like setting up a signal chain or A-Bing things. Like, never. It was all about the part, the song, the arrangement. And so that was a huge thing. Just being able to witness some of that record come together. And then also to hear the final CLA mix a few months later. And it was like, wait a second, like, this sounds exactly like what I heard in the control room. Like, it's like 20% more exciting sounding, but like, those are the sounds I heard. Like, the drums, it didn't sound like there were samples on them or anything. I was like, that's what it sounded like when they tracked it. And so that was another big light bulb where it was like, wait a second, all these top records where the mixes sound so good, it's because it sounded almost that good before it was even mixed, And so that was a huge realization there. So that was a big moment in my life. And then aside from that, it was just conversations with people who were ahead of me, other producers who I managed to find like online and who were kind enough to respond to my annoying private messages. That was a really huge thing. And this was before YouTube, really. I think I started recording and I was doing that internship really either right when YouTube was starting or maybe it wasn't out yet. So there wasn't online courses. There was just a couple forums and some magazines that I read and everything. But yeah, it was really that real world interaction of being in that room and then also just talking to producers who are ahead of me. That's kind of how I made the biggest strides forward.
Yeah, and you've said that a few times today. If you can find someone else that's ahead of you and you can learn from them, I completely agree with that. And unfortunately, I have had some other people that I know who did internships like that or externships at really big studios, and unfortunately, they didn't have quite as good of an experience as you did. They were more so just like the coffee person. Yep. And so I wanted to ask you also about this concept of mentorship. We have YouTube nowadays. We have fantastic courses online like yours, and then we also have college. And now with COVID, I think this presents a very interesting discussion, because a lot of colleges have gone to online. So what are your thoughts between the different learning platforms? Is it really worth, going to college and getting a traditional degree? Are there benefits more so to going to online courses like yours?
Yeah, I think, I personally never went to audio college. So I can't from firsthand experience speak to that. However, all I can say is that, I've had a few thousand people through my recording and mixing courses now, and I've been told over and over and over again from them that they learned more in 3 hours of these from this online course than they did from 4 years in tens of thousands of dollars in, the really big fancy audio colleges. So, it kind of breaks my heart a little bit because it's like, I know that they have all this debt and it's just like, if they just would have had this sooner, they could have skipped that step, right? And saved that money. So that's just what I've seen. From we talked earlier, I'd be interested to hear I think there probably are some benefits from going to a regular college that I just maybe don't know. Maybe you could tell me more about that.
Yeah, sure. So I did go to one of those, nice 4-year colleges, and I didn't start off in audio engineering. At that time, I was actually in game design, and I'm not sure why I was there. I just liked the creating in the virtual world, but I was in bands and I was recording, and then around my sophomore year, I was kind of like, why am I leaving class to go home and record bands? Why don't I just switch over? So I finished it in 2 years, my degree there, and what I will say is I know myself when I was in 18, 19 years old, I needed to learn a little bit more professionalism and determination on how to pursue and get what it was that I needed from audio. And I know that kind of leaves it really vague that through college, I think you definitely get professionalism, what it is to meet deadlines, what it is to set a goal for yourself and then pursue it. The networking is obviously very, very important. And at the same time, kind of like what you said, when I got out of college, or let me say, before I was in college, before I graduated and switched over to audio, I remember thinking, this is great. When I switch to audio, when I get out, I'll be able to mix the Black Album, right? This horribly unrealistic expectation. Right. And of course, once I graduated, I could not mix and master a professional album. And that doesn't mean that, in my experience, it doesn't mean that the college education wasn't purposeful, because it exposed me to many different things that have certainly been really impactful in my life now, and even the career that I'm in with hearing sciences and understanding research and hearing conservation, the physics and psychoacoustics and acoustics and all that stuff that goes into audio as well. And what I can definitely tell people is I think both are helpful. For someone who needed kind of, I'd say, a little kick when they were in their late teens, early 20s, going to school kind of forces you to develop yourself and develop your opinions. It pushes you outside of your comfort zone, which is extremely helpful. But then also in school, you learn kind of not just this is specifically how to record guitar. You learn a much broader scope of that. But at the same time, then some stuff is left out. So when I graduated college, I actually didn't know how to time-align drums. I didn't know very much about comping, which is kind of embarrassing to say when you leave a really big college. But
right.
that was something that I had to struggle. And I know you mentioned that in your courses, like we've already talked about. You go online then to try and find the answers, and you find a plethora of different options. And it takes a lot of time then to develop your skills. So what I would say is both are useful. Both are extremely useful. If you can find a college, a university, it doesn't have to be a 4-year program, even a 2-year program. And if you can go there and you can speak with the professors and see what it is that they're capable of, what it is that they're interested in, what their past experience has been, what are the facilities, and then you can go there and learn that and also supplement it with, like classes like yours, for example. And maybe it's a little too medical, but the way I think about it, like you can get your MD, become, a primary care physician, but then you can also specialize in being like an ears, nose, and throat doctor or a pediatrician. So I would think that your class then is the specialization. That is the extra step to being like, okay, well, now you are an audio engineer that specializes in metal or rock recording. I think they can both lend off of and build off of one another very, very well.
Yeah, I think I like the point you made about just kind of getting out of your own bubble and being accountable, like in a school setting like that. I think that's important, because that's one downside to trying to learn yourself with online courses is, I mean, this stat is really old, but I remember hearing something that like 90% of online courses that are bought are people don't finish them. They never go through them. And so if you need that kind of outside accountability to force you to like show up and hand in the assignment or whatever, like, then I can see that being that is definitely a possible shortfall of online courses. But yeah, I think those are good points. And I think the online world is continuing to evolve too. And that's something like, 5 years ago when I started putting out my first mixing courses, it was just a course. Like you buy the videos, you get access to the videos. Now it's like seeing, like you said, more of a need for that accountability, having kind of benchmarks that you're pushing people towards, helping them finish the course, having hands-on like group coaching or higher level like one-on-one coaching and feedback on your mixes. And so you can kind of get that real world interaction, still virtual, but still get that kind of hands-on feedback that is missing from the online world. I think that more and more people are trying to do that as well. So yeah, I kind of see like these two sides just getting closer and closer, honestly, over time. Maybe they'll just kind of blend into one thing. I don't know.
Like I said, with COVID, a lot of it's being questioned now because much teaching has gone online, and you can still find good ways to have very positive learning outcomes through that. So we'll definitely see more changing as the years come. But I would definitely say both are very, very helpful paths. So before we wrap up, if you could go back to your younger self, and maybe you've already answered this, but what is it that you would tell yourself? Let's say when you first got all that studio gear, you rented the space, what would be one trick or tip, just general knowledge, that you would tell yourself?
I mean, it's hard for me not to go back to just like get it right at the source, like stop trying to fix it in the mix. That was pretty much the whole like first few years of me trying to record bands, was like just rush through the tracking, get it done as fast as I could, because I really didn't know what I was doing. So I just wanted the band to leave so that I could mess around with everything after by myself, right? And it just, you're not going to get good results that way. So I think just realizing that like, hey, what you're capturing now, like this is determining the final quality that you're going to get. And so in that sense, avoiding like the trap of just being obsessed with gear. Like I definitely went through that phase, and maybe everyone has to go through it, where it's like you're just obsessed with getting the best gear, the cool vintage analog piece or the expensive mics. Like I went through all that. I bought and sold a lot of gear, wasted a lot of money. I bought mics for vocals that were $3,000-$4,000, and then I got this thing and I was like, wait a second, this is beating it every time. Like, it's a tenth of the cost. So I would hopefully be able to avoid some of that by, again, making it's not about the gear. It's about, getting the best source tones and the best performances. And that's ultimately, that's 90% of the job. So the funny thing is when I look back, it's like my journey when I first started, like I said, all I knew was like the fader and the pan knob. I didn't know there were other tools. And so because of that, ironically, like at the very beginning, I was trying to get the best tones. I didn't know about solving performance issues, but I knew that I was like if it didn't sound right, I would like try a different mic, or I'd like try to put the mic in a different spot, or I'd get a different amp, because I didn't know that I could EQ. And then when I started learning about all the fancy technical tools, then I like stopped caring about the source, and it was all about like fixing it and mangling it later. And then it kind of eventually came back full circle, right? Where again, it was about getting it right at the source, but now I finally had the tools and the knowledge to actually do that. So maybe that's a long answer to the question, but just, I don't know if you can avoid that journey though. I think hopefully you can get through it a little faster than I did. And if you're investing in education and courses, whatever it is, and mentorship, you will kind of skip a lot of that painful trial and error. But yeah, I don't know what you think. Like, I think there is I think everyone does go through that process of like beginner, you're excited, then you get overwhelmed, all this stuff that you could do. And then you finally come out the other side with like a simpler approach, but with the skills and the knowledge to pull it off.
Yeah, it's a great point. And I think it can be very discouraging when there is such great work out there and there's such expensive gear out there. But if you can always go back to some of your original work, listen to it as like a personal inspiration to see just how far you've come, it can help keep you going. Because I think you're right. It is a personal journey that you do have to take. If it were that easy, everyone would be able to do it, right? Everyone would be producing professional albums.
Exactly, yeah.
So we've covered a lot, Jordan, and I absolutely love what you've told us and some of the insights and the stories that you've shared, the different audio myths. I completely agree with them. Is there one burning question or concept topic that we've missed?
You know what? I think I've seen a little bit, or maybe a lot, of kind of just negativity about kind of the recording industry, the music industry in general. And I think it's just completely unfounded and wrong. I think that the music industry as a whole, and including the recording industry, it's very pessimistic and very far behind in the business sense. And so that's why you get people online commenting like the music industry is dead. You can't make any money as a producer engineer. Like you're basically resigned to being a broke, starving artist. And it's just not true. Like I don't think anyone should have this doomsday attitude where like because anyone could pick up a recording rig and record at home, that doesn't mean that this whole role is disappearing. Like, and for the proof of that is just like I have students every single year in and year out, who are starting new studio businesses, getting their work out there, landing new clients, even going full time. We had a couple of students go full time as engineers during COVID. So, that is just proof that it's kind of all up here. Is like, are you going to feel like defeated of like, oh, wow, the band can record themselves. Why are they going to hire me? Like, no, I think that music isn't going anywhere. And in order for artists to have people hear their music, it needs to be recorded and it needs to be mixed and there needs to be a final version. And so this role is always going to exist. I think it might change and evolve, and the means to doing it will evolve with technology, but music isn't going anywhere. Recorded music isn't going anywhere. So there's a lot of opportunity ahead. So just be willing to constantly be learning and growing. And I think there's a great future ahead.
Well, thank you for ending on such a positive note. I love that. And you really do offer some great courses. I can't recommend them enough. So if people are interested in hearing more about just your general positive thoughts about the music industry, recording, mixing, mastering, where can they go to find more information?
Yeah, they can go to hardcoremusicstudio.com. You can also just go on YouTube and search Hardcore Music Studio or search for my name. Find my channel there. I try to put out new videos basically every week. There's tons of videos there for free for you to learn. I encourage you to just try out some of the techniques I show. And I think the ultimate test of whether a tip is good or not on YouTube is just try it. Watch it. Do what they say. Does it make your work sound better? Does it make things easier? Then you should keep listening to that person. So yeah, you can check that out. And then if you want to go deeper, then, just sign up to my email list and I send extra stuff through there. And then anytime I'm opening up my bigger courses, you'll get those emails. So yeah, that's kind of how you can follow along.
All right. Well, Jordan, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure talking with you, and stay in touch.
Yeah. Thank you. Had a good time.